Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of A Modern Nonprofit Podcast. I'm Tasha Anderson. I'll be your host today. But we're not going to be talking about accounting today. We're going to be talking about something else that I find really interesting. Danielle, I saw your bio and I saw your work, and I was really interested to dive into this conversation because I've been working in the nonprofit space for many, many years. I've been aware and had many conversations about having awareness and intentionality around people with all different sorts of backgrounds, abilities. And I also attend a lot of events, and we try to marry those two things together. So I was really interested to hear a little bit more about your work and what you're talking about. And for those of you that have not had a chance to meet you yet, I'm bringing on my friend, Dr. Daniela Ferdico, and she is working with kind of bringing awareness to the space on sensory and making sensory accessible to people, or making events accessible to people that might struggle with sensory disorders and other things that might be difficult for them, for other people that may not have that. So you created sensory access. Tell us a little bit about that, and tell us why that might be relevant to the nonprofit world or to everyone's world, frankly.
Sure, certainly. So yeah, my daughter and I started Sensory Access, in 2017 now, way before there were any thoughts of a pandemic coming our way. And what we kind of learned through being really active in the community. So lots of theater, lots of musicals, sports events. We travel a ton. My son is autistic, my daughter's neurodivergent, so am I. And so we really try to push the envelope of continuing to build our cognitive flexibility by putting ourselves into as many situations as we can. And that it's uncomfortable sometimes, but it really helps build that cognitive flexibility. What we noticed is that a lot of these events we went to is that a lot of people really struggle. So let's say, you're at a theater event and there's a family there, and partway through they have to leave because they can't handle the bright flashing lights or a big surprise moment that happens during that show. Or there was another incident where we took our son who'd been wanting to go to this practice camp for the Seahawks, and he'd just been waiting to go. We finally got tickets. We went there, and it was so sensory overwhelming from all the, adult men kind of pushing around to the sounds and the lights. It was so overwhelming. We've been there 5 minutes. He's been waiting for months, and he's like, I gotta go home. I can't be here. And it was just like us seeing him wanting to do something so badly and then not getting the opportunity like other people there to do it. And we were able to kind of make some different things work from some really nice people there that allowed him to access the space where there wasn't the crowding and the pushing and everything. And my daughter and I just started thinking, like, why isn't that more common? Why is there accessibility for some things, so for someone that has a mobility difficulty, but rarely do I see accessibility options for someone who is hard of hearing or blind? That's happening a little bit more, but you don't see that as often. And then you certainly barely ever see accessibility for individuals that are autistic or have Down syndrome or have sensory differences in how their brain processes sensory information, so that crowding and lights and sounds really do become incapacitating, right? And so that's why we created Sensory Access. And we, I've been part of the events world for a long time, and so that tends to be our focus as travel and events, because that's what we know the best, and really trying to figure out what are some tools and some awareness we can create in that world to make events accessible to everyone, because everyone should have the opportunity to, be with their community and watch a show, see a concert, alongside everybody else, not segregated off somewhere else. And so that's our goal, is to make all of these things happen for everyone.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I was thinking how many times I've worked with organizations that work with populations that would fall under any of those categories that you had mentioned, and they themselves hold events. I used to work for an organization that held events, and I would definitely say, in hindsight, looking back, that I guess the right word would be sensitivity to other people's limited sensory, whether it's visual or, like you said, hearing, or just sudden movements and sounds and lights, and all of these things weren't really taken into consideration. And I think it's one of those things a lot of people just don't think about it, but maybe they should be thinking about it more.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Which brings
I
me to
think
my
in the
next
nonprofit world, there's so many events that happen, right? So we have fundraisers all the time in the nonprofit world. And is there a thought that goes into making sure that everyone has access to those, the guests, the artists that are presenting or, creating entertainment, is it accessible to them? Is the art form or whatever, usually a lot of times at a fundraiser, you might have something that you want to wow the audience with. Well, sometimes that wow factor includes lots of, sensory impact, which is great for creating an impact, but you want to make sure that's an accessible impact for everybody.
So speaking of that, what are you doing to make events more accessible? Because when I start thinking about this accessibility, and I don't know if I'm alone, but I'm just starting to think, okay, what kind of, you can go down the path of being sensitive to all the different accessibility needs, right? Where do you kind of get started? How do you make events more accessible? Where should you kind of start from, or what should be the baseline that you should be starting from?
Yeah.
And then kind of going upwards from there. So what are you doing, or helping with, I should say, to help making events more accessible?
So I think in general, if you are putting together an event, I think the first most important thing is to really speak to people, either experts in that field of accessibility or experts, or people that come from that perspective, right? Because we don't want to design an environment or an event for someone that's autistic or hard of hearing without having someone from that community be part of that decision-making process, right? There's this, phrase, nothing about us without us, right? That a lot of people in the disability community say like, hey, if you're going to create something to help us, let us be part of that decision making and show you what we need instead of some higher up somewhere deciding what we need, right? So for us, for example, at Sensory Access, we're all neurodiverse, and we have individuals that are hard of hearing, have visual impairments, et cetera, on our staff that we consult with. So that's a really important piece. I think really almost any environment can be made sensory accessible. We've made Lollapalooza, the music festival, accessible across a couple of different places on the globe. We've just recently been working with the World's Fair, which is in Dubai this time around. And that is the first ever sensory accessible World's Fair. And we do that through a variety of things. The most important thing, I think, is providing information. So if you're a person whose brain processes sensory information differently, usually more, strongly, and it has more of an impact on you, what you don't want is to be surprised. So if I want, let's say if I'm at the World's Fair and I want to go look at the Italy pavilion, I have no idea what to expect. I might go in and it might be really peaceful as I walk in, and I might turn a corner and go in one room and all of a sudden there's strobing flashing light and big sounds and an immersive 360-degree video. And I have a complete, panic, right? Because I can't handle that environment. So part of what we do at Sensory Access is any given event or environment is we go through and we bring our team of autistic and sensory processing individuals through an environment and we rate it. So we rate it on, audio, including taking decibel levels, visual, tactile, scent, sometimes there's scents in places that we wouldn't expect, and someone could be sensitive to that. So we go through all of that. And then we create a sensory rating card that lets anyone that's about to go through a space or an event know, like, hey, before you go through this, here's some places, here's all the places, and here's what their sensory impact is. So then that person can decide, okay, maybe I can do the whole thing, or maybe I avoid that one room because I don't like that. I don't want my brain experiencing that, right? Or maybe I go through that room, but I put my headphones on, or I put my sunglasses on, or whatever that individual needs to make it through an experience. So now all of a sudden they have information ahead of time. They can enjoy it alongside their family or friends or community. They don't have to be segregated out, but they have everything that they need in order to do that safely, right? And that makes a big, big difference. At some place like Lollapalooza, for example, and if not everybody knows, that's a huge music festival that's done in Chicago, in the US, and then all over the world. What we do is we have staff members at every stage. So in case there is someone in the crowd that is starting to struggle, that, we know who they are ahead of time and we can kind of help them navigate that. We have sensory friendly areas where they can come. We have a whole tented area with special seating and headphones and earplugs and fidgets and, sensory chairs. So they can come and kind of take a sensory break and then go back out into where it is really, really crazy. But now that their sensory system has reset, they can, feel like they can do that. So it's all about, giving someone the choices that they can make for themselves in how they can regulate their sensory environment, even in places where, the norm is kind of a crazy environment. As long as you have a place to kind of retreat to for a little bit, and you also know what to expect, that's most of the battle right there.
I think that's really interesting to kind of map through an event and almost kind of even on a smaller scale, because we work with a lot of really small social service agencies, but I'm just thinking and I've been to many nonprofit events that they can control, right? And I just think as I'm going through the experience, even just the original entryway of going in and lots of people and lots of busyness and where am I going? Am I going the right place? Very overwhelming, even for people that maybe aren't sensitive to some of these, unexpected moments during that time. And then, it's just, okay, what do I got to do? I have to go here and I have to go there. And then the loud music and the band playing and all these sorts of things. So I really like the idea of mapping through your event, even if it's a smaller event, just to kind of think, what would any person be experiencing and how would other people might take this, and would it be really difficult? And I know sometimes audio is really bad in events, so I'm imagining like having text written up on the projector screen so people can follow along, otherwise may not be able to hear, whether because, and it's a good backup plan too, because if the audio doesn't work, then hey, everybody wins. So I love that.
It kind of goes back to the idea of universal design, right? The idea of universal design is you create something for everyone. And when you create something for everyone, that includes people with different types of, disabilities and abilities and et cetera. And so your example is a perfect example, right? If I'm going to just a small nonprofit event, but I don't know how to get there, which one is the entrance? Where do I go to register? What is the sound going to be like? What am I expecting? Is there entertainment? What is it going to be like? So in that instance, usually we create what we call a social narrative. So we'll meet with the meeting, facilitators, and we'll say, okay, we're going to come and we're going to take pictures of the front door. We're going to take pictures of where the setup, the registration table is going to be. We want to schedule of events. We want to find out what is the sound going to be like. If someone's sound sensitive, maybe they want to sit near the back. If they have some visual impairments, maybe they want to sit up close. Can we have, either captions or an ASL interpreter, or what are some of the things that we can bring into this event to make it accessible for everyone? And there are some really easy, small things, including the social narrative, which is such a simple thing to do, to really make it more accessible. And then everybody wins from that, right? Like, most people would love to have a document that says, hey, you're going to go here. It looks like this. So this is what's going to happen, right? That's helpful for everyone, not just that, percentage of people that have disabilities. And so I think in the end, going back to the idea of universal design is really, really helpful. But again, it also needs to be done in a way that is helpful and kind. What I see a lot of times is I see these social stories that are written for autistic individuals. And so I'll say something like, oh, here's a social study or a social narrative for a museum. But for some reason, most of the ones I see out there are written as if they're written to a 5-year-old. I'm going to go to the museum and I'm going to do this, which is great for the small population of young children that might read that social story. But an autistic adult or an autistic teenager can be offended by that, right? Because they don't want to read something in that. And so I think it's really important, again, involve the very group of people that you want to help, right? So have someone come in and create these accessibility things for you that is coming from that perspective. So it's done respectfully and helpfully, and with the idea of something that is helpful for everyone.
I love that example that you gave, because I think sometimes people think, and one of the things that comes to my mind, we have a local circus and they have, a kind of a sensory accessible event every year. It's like, of all of them, just like they have like a No Peanuts show, they also have a sensory sensitive show. And I think when people think of things like this, maybe I'm just projecting because I'm thinking of the circus, that the children can't handle the overstimulation of what they're doing and what they're experiencing. But you bring up a really great point. There are many adults. I would like to have a manual that tells me who, what, when, where, why, what do I, it's kind of a joke. I tell people I'm not the ride or diver. I'm the ride along, ask 10,000 questions. What are we doing? What am I eating? When am I coming back? Like, what's going on? Who will be there? I need to know all of the questions. And I really like what you had said. And I think maybe I'm projecting a little bit, because I think sometimes people assume small children, but could be absolutely adults that have the need to understand these things as well and speak in a tone that would be respectful of any adult. So I really like that. So a lot of the stuff you talk about, it's not just because, you yourself or your daughter or your son, as you had mentioned, have, any sort of disability or neurodiverse, but you actually have a background in studying how the brain works and helping people coach through that. So you're a neuropsychologist, and I'm curious to know, through your own lived experience of your family, as well as your background, how have you leveraged that educational background? Like, well, I'm not just, lived it, but I've learned it through my education. How do you bring that to the forefront of your event planning? What do you use there?
That's a really good question. So yeah, I mean, I've been a neuropsychologist since 1999 now, and I've always been fascinated by, how our brain works, but specifically with how do we process the world? How do we process when we see things or process information differently, whether that's our attitude in life or that, this specifically what we're talking about now, which is that sensory processing piece, right? And I think a lot of people still unfortunately make that assumption that like, well, what is this sensory processing? Like, oh, okay, they just think it's a little louder. No, our brain is very much capable of processing things in different ways. In their, study after study has been done that some individuals really do process in that part of their brain, where they process sensory, they process it differently. It is more impactful to them. And so it is, really difficult to make it through certain types of environments. And so I try to do some education on, so it depends on my audience, right? Sometimes we'll get down and talk about neuroanatomy. Sometimes we'll bring real life examples. And then in terms of my practice, so I have a private practice still where I still do diagnosis. I work with kids all the way up through in their 20s. And so I work a lot with them and with their families. And I hear so many stories about, we never travel. We never go to Disneyland. We can't do that. We could never do that. And it's like, oh my gosh, no, let me tell you how you can do that. You deserve to go. You should be able to do all the things everybody else does. And here's how, right? And so it kind of goes back and forth through all of the schooling and education and experiences I bring to it. I bring that to sensory access. And then of course, the stuff I do at sensory access flows into my practice as well. And really trying to give people this hope and this energy to try some of these things and like trying different ways of making it through those experiences. And I think, having this really odd experience of, kind of my educational background and my personal experiences at least makes for a really rich point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with, there is always something to having the educational component, but then you couple that with real life. I've lived it. I've had to navigate it personally with my children. I've successfully traveled or I've successfully done this or that experience while still navigating some of those waters makes it so much more credible and relatable for so many parents. So, I think in the nonprofit world, we see the value of, being inclusive. And I think sometimes we probably still miss the mark on so many different things. And this conversation really, I was really interested about this conversation and the topic when it was, when I was reading through all the prep materials. And I think it's an area where we maybe just don't think about it as much as we should. And obviously inclusivity is important, but I'm curious to know from your perspective why this is so important with sensory, and maybe elaborate a little bit more on, because I think some people think sensory, they think on the autism spectrum, or you had mentioned some like visual or hearing, maybe some other examples that, oh, I didn't think about that as being inclusive or not inclusive, right? I think we can all agree it's important, but what are some of those other disabilities that you were referencing, and why those are so important to kind of think about and not lose sight of just because they're not, as mainstream as maybe we think they are. They're not as impactful, or not as many people suffer from them as we think.
Well, I think for me, the most important thing is to, again, be really specific with information, right? So when you're, for example, asking about different disabilities, it can be someone who has epilepsy as an example, right? We don't necessarily think about that, but usually there's, a strobe warning, like, oh, if you go into this building, there will be flashing lights, or this movie. But you've now, by doing that, made the entire thing completely inaccessible to that person with photosensitive epilepsy. What should happen instead, if it's a movie or if it's an event or an experience, to say, hey, in this one room over here, there's strobing light. Or 1 hour into this show, there's strobing light. That allows that person to go in, enjoy it for whatever period of time. And then when they know the strobing is coming up, either put on sunglasses if that's helpful enough to them, or leave them that experience for the moment and then go back. But when we just say like, oh, this has strobing, sorry, that's not helpful. That's not inclusive, because you're saying the entire experience is not now within reach for that person, right? And so same thing, if we go through an experience, if we were just to say, oh, well, this experience, this music festival, or this, evening of nonprofit, fundraising is going to be loud. So just so you know, that is not helpful or inclusive information. We need to give specific information so individuals that have disabilities can make choices for themselves and can choose what accommodations they need in order to be able to attend that experience, instead of basically being told you can't attend, right? And there's a huge difference there. And I think that's why it's so important to provide that information.
Absolutely. So if somebody were, wanting to do a little self-audit of their events or events maybe that they participate in and say, hey, you might think about this. You had mentioned before that you work with some pretty large events or venues that put on, events that are more accessible to people or trying to be more accessible to people. If somebody wanted to chat with you, follow along with your work, read more about you, where would be the best place to find that information? If somebody's like, this is completely slipped off my radar and I need it to be on my radar, where would be the best place people can chat with you?
Probably the best place is our website. We have some examples of our work there, just kind of an explanation of what we do, the different certifications that we offer if someone wants to have a certification of events. So everything's there. It's sensoryaccess.org.
Sensoryaccess.org. Excellent.
Yeah.
So you yourself are a nonprofit, huh?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Excellent. Excellent. So great. Any last, pieces of advice that nonprofit leaders could be kind of taking into consideration when they're thinking, I really love what you're saying. I don't even know how to get started. I'm really overwhelmed, or any other pieces of advice that you've learned, not just running your organization, but also through a sensory lens, working with other organizations. Any final bits of advice that you might give to leaders of organizations that might be interested in hearing this and looking to be more progressive in the work that they're doing and the events that they hold?
Absolutely. I think, the most important thing is just to have it as part of your design process for an event. When you're planning an event, think about how can I make this accessible to everyone? And then it sounds overwhelming, but it's really not. If you talk to someone like myself, and there's other organizations out there, right? If you just bring someone in who has experience doing this, they will do it for you, with you, in a way that it's affordable to really help you do it. So it's not so overwhelming. It shouldn't be an overwhelming process. And, that experience of walking away from having done it the first time and then the second time, it becomes a lot easier. And it's really just like, okay, I needed to make sure when I'm designing this event that I do this, this, and this. It's always easier when you go into it that way versus at the very end, like, oh, my event's in a week, we should be accessible. Can you help me? That happens to me all the time. I've literally had people call me at like, hey, our event's, on Monday, and we haven't really thought about accessibility. What can you do? It's like, well, it's a little hard at this point. So the more, all of the different pieces are thought about and designed and planned at the outset, the easier and less expensive it really is. So.
Oh, that's a good point. Okay, so sensoryaccess.org, they can find you there. Okay, well, Dr. Ferdico, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your experiences. I love hearing some of your practical tips. Something, frankly, I've not thought enough about. I think when we think of disabilities, we think of just 20 years ago, physical disabilities and accessibilities. And I'm starting to see more and more accessibilities with other disabilities. And I think it's a conversation we need to continue having and figure out how we can do better and better. And as the nonprofit community, continue to be role models for those that maybe aren't in this space, but because we work with all different populations, we should certainly be more in tune with this. So thank you again for bringing this conversation to light and sharing your resources. And check out sensoryaccess.org if you want more information. Thank you again. Until next time, everybody.